Seems like everything here is normal, and no one will judge or wag a finger at me, so I'll also tell a story that has stuck in my memory for the rest of my life. I was 13 years old, waiting for my mom late in the evening from work. I hung out on the balcony and peered at the bus stop where my mom was supposed to come from. The streets were very well lit, and besides, it was summer, around 11 p.m., and it was still surprisingly bright. Those who live in Moscow will understand. The period late May, early June. At that time, we lived in a strange place, where opposite our residential high-rise there was an abandoned old cemetery. Behind the house, slightly lower, a Catholic church, and the house itself stood at the intersection of these two places, and they even stuck an architectural monument across 2 stories high for some reason on the platform of this intersection. There were few people at that time. Almost everyone had gone to their dachas. No one walked or strolled there as usual in the evenings. And then I look at this part of the road, and there's a very strange woman walking, trembling a little, with a very large head, which was noticeable even from the 5th floor, disproportionate to her body and arms. She's walking very quickly towards this place at the intersection where the cross stands on the go. Instantly, she falls to her knees, and this is all under the streetlights. The view is superb, and she gets up not as a woman, but as a dog. She just keeps running further, as if nothing had happened. We didn't have mobile phones back then to call and warn my mom, but I was most afraid that she would be walking there now, and that monster would be running somewhere nearby. But I quickly overcame my fear, took my cat with me, and headed to the bus stop. Through that place, cats are supposed to scare off evil spirits, right, to escort my mom and tell her all about it. Of course, she didn't believe me, just like no one else I tried to tell about what I saw did. But one day, while visiting my friend's grandmother in the dense Siberian wilderness during evening gatherings with her friends, I heard all sorts of things about similar mystical phenomena, and all of them agreed only on one thing: I was lucky to see it from such a distance. Otherwise, such people meet a sudden death in the same place. To say that I was scared is an understatement. It was around that time, about a week later, that I discovered the first gray hairs on my head. In my youth, when I was about 19, I went to study in England, in the splendid city of Bath. One late evening, after a routine hangout at the local pub with friends from Russia, equally as foolish as I, we decided, having had a couple of pints each, to head home. We considered ourselves decent folk, at least that's what we thought, not really drunk, but rather cheerful. The journey back to our host families took quite a while, as we had to walk from the center of Bath to the residential areas. Along the way, we noticed a cemetery, vast, old, and beautiful, but locked. There was a lock on the massive gates with a warning sign: you were not invited. Go away until morning. We decided to spend some time there, not too drunk and impressed by the beauty of the place. We strolled through the cemetery, admiring the old tombstones and dates of death, until we noticed that it was being patrolled by a guard with a dog. We quickly blended into the surroundings, hiding behind bushes, pondering our fate. We sat on the graves, peering through the bushes at the guard and his dog, who had yet to spot us. That's when I saw on the adjacent tombstone, just a meter away from me, between me and my friend, a figure of earthy brown color, as if a shadow rising from the ground, in the exact same pose as me, if I may say so, squatting, and I saw it for exactly a second, while the others didn't notice at all. At that moment, I felt a very unpleasant and indescribable sensation, but it clearly conveyed to me that someone here really didn't like me, and that they were very displeased not so much with my actions as with my mere presence on this patch of earth. I briefly explained my feelings and thoughts to my comrades, who by that time were eager to continue exploring the cemetery, after which, to my surprise, they readily agreed to my proposal to leave. And that's that. Another story within the story. Short. It happened not so much to me as to my mother. It was a long time ago. I was so young that I was still being pushed in a stroller, and the times were such that parents were not afraid to leave children on the street. It was winter. My mother needed to go to the store, and she wanted to take me with her to get some fresh air. But for some reason, she didn't feel like doing it. And my mom to this day doesn't like doing things she really doesn't want to do. So she went to the store alone and didn't leave me on the street in front of the store, where she always left me, and where everyone else left their children at the time, so as not to drag them into the store. When my mother returned, she saw a scene that horrified me more and more as I grew older. In the place where the stroller with me should have been standing, there was another one, pierced through and through by a huge icicle, from which blood was flowing onto the ground. The feeling of such a bad premonition that visited my mother that day, she remembers very well. Oh, another story of mine. Also short and again about my mother, but this time I took more part in it. I was a few years older then, not a child anymore but a teenager who didn't want to, but sometimes found trouble. And we also had a wonderful and dearly beloved Doberman with my mother, with whom she loved to walk for a long time, at least 40 minutes. So it was a late summer month of August. I was home alone. My mother had just gone for a walk with the dog, and I wanted to eat watermelon. And somehow it didn't occur to me how to cut it, being new and not yet opened. And I came up with the simplest option to press it against my chest with my left hand and cut it with a knife with my right. Said and done. And I cut my left wrist almost to the tendon, effectively sprinkling myself and everything around me with blood as I ran around the apartment in search of a bandage. After all, I didn't want to stain my clothes, tablecloth, or sheets, right? According to my mother's description, who clearly missed her letter to Hogwarts, she suddenly felt the urge to go home, even though she hadn't walked our lovely half-hundredweight dog for even 10 minutes. Returning home, she saw that it wasn't in vain the door to the apartment was open, very quiet, and literally blood everywhere. I can hardly imagine what was going on in her head at that moment, but my mother's mother was a nurse, and now all I'm reminded of those days is a red stripe on my arm that gets closer to my elbow every year. Well, and my last story, even shorter, but exclusively about me. I was older now, no longer a teenager but not yet a man, and I was walking to school that day as usual. For this, I needed to cross a quiet road in both directions, but there was no pedestrian crossing. Despite the headphones I never parted with, from which Ramstein or Bye 2 sounded, I crossed it calmly, as the city-bound lane was dead, clogged with cars, and as I passed between two bumpers, already raising my foot to take a quick step onto the oncoming lane, I only looked in the right direction. In the direction of traffic, I was literally jerked by something. It was such a cold feeling, seemingly neither a gust of wind nor a shake, as if someone had grabbed me by the shoulders and pulled me. Neither back nor forth, but as if to bring me to my senses, causing me to freeze in place. The main point is that the next second, when I was supposed to be on the road, a car drove at full speed along it in the opposite direction. Despite the fact that, having caught my breath a little, I went to school, I was so shocked by the fact that I was still alive, and that something had held me back from this fatal coincidence, that I gave myself the meal of not swearing for many more months. I was 10 years old when my mom bought a huge plot of land with a large mansion on the outskirts of that village. For us, it was a country house, and we spent the whole summer there. Across from our gates, beyond the intersection, was a field shrouded in darkness and fog. One day, my friend escorted me to that very intersection late at night. We got carried away chatting, and at some point I noticed on that same field, in the fog, a group of people moving toward us. They weren't just walking, they were gliding. But the scariest thing was that right in the center, I distinctly saw a wedding dress. I couldn't believe my eyes and began to reassure myself that it was just garbage that had been taken out. Realizing that my friend had fallen silent, I turned to him. He was looking in the same direction with his mouth open and a frightened expression. I asked what he saw. In my hysteria, he said that a bride was coming toward us. I had never been so scared in my life. We ran to my house screaming and crying, not even looking back, and literally soiled ourselves. My mom heard us and got scared, but just laughed at our story, thinking we were fantasizing. My friend was taken home by his grandmother, and the next morning, I asked to be taken to the city. I didn't want to go back there for anything. Even arguments with my mom ensued. She thought I just didn't want to help at the country house and made up such a tale. In the same village, but at the other end, my godmother had a house. A couple of years later, she asked my mom why I never visited. Mom told her about the bride. My godmother was shocked and told how about 15 years before our purchase, in that village, there was a wedding. At the site of that field, there was a swamp back then. The young people and guests drank a lot of alcohol and ended up there. The groom, bride, and a couple of other guests died. Mom quickly sold that plot of land without explaining the reasons. Only after I finished school did she tell me that I really saw it. With age, I began to consider it my rich imagination, but no, I'm not a fan of mystical heresy. I just don't want to know anything about it or delve into it. I am sane, but I will never admit that it didn't happen, and I refuse to go to that village. Never. On your YouTube channel, and not only yours, in my opinion, people are skeptical about what cannot be proven with evidence. But anyway, here's my story. As you can see from my line of work, I have encountered the supernatural more than once. It all started in the time before adolescence. Due to my introversion, I had little interaction with peers, which resulted in less energy expenditure than others. As a result, I didn't fall asleep for a long time after the parental command to go to sleep. At a time when everyone else was asleep, I would lie down and contemplate or daydream. On one of those nights, I heard the sound of the cupboard door opening in the kitchen. From my room, I could clearly see where the light was on in the apartment. Well, it wasn't on anywhere. After that came the sound of dishes moving on the wooden surface. I ran through all the options in my head, but I clearly understood that no one got up, especially in the pitch darkness, to rummage through cups. This lasted for about 30 seconds of real time. The door slammed shut. Footsteps were heard coming from the kitchen. Taking a defensive position under the covers and leaving a hole for observation, I waited. With a slight tremor, attempting to regain my breath, I watched the doorway. Moonlight barely illuminated the hallway. The footsteps got closer and closer. They sounded like shoes walking on parquet flooring. Then they reached the doorway of my room. As if a person covered in a sheet stood and watched. I don't remember exactly what was going on in my head, but I prayed as best I could. It turned around and went towards the exit. No, the door didn't open. The sound of the footsteps receding echoed dully from the hallway. I don't know if I fell asleep or not, but after that, I definitely started studying supernatural phenomena. Of the recent events that firmly settled in my mind, I can only recall the childish sobs from the corridor of my apartment at 2 a.m., but holy water and mantras do their job. It's been blessed. my story differs from others, at least because I tried to exaggerate as little as possible. It happened literally last night, April 27th. The door to the other rooms was closed. There were no curtains on the windows, but they were also closed. So the room is usually quite stuffy, and there is no one to open the windows because I am alone at home. Towards morning, around 4 or 5 o'clock, I felt a chill, and then coldness struck, and I began to shiver. The feeling that someone was definitely nearby struck me, and I immediately fell asleep. After that, there was a short dialogue in a dream with someone of the male gender. I don't remember what it was about, but someone said they regretted something. That was the last phrase, and I opened my eyes, looking at the window. It was closed as always. Again, the room was stuffy, and I realized that I had been talking to a ghost, someone deceased. Yes, I'm sure it was something similar. As for what happened next, I think a logical explanation can be found, especially considering that I have astigmatism. But still, I'll tell you. Next, I looked around the room, and with my peripheral vision, I noticed something resembling a light anomaly, and I'm on observation duty, like a slowly moving light rabbit. Maybe it was a reflection, but it ran in a very strange trajectory and then disappeared without a trace. Also, there were black or light spots moving along the walls, and when I turned to them, they disappeared. But again, I think there's an explanation for this. Personally, I've never been afraid of ghosts because I understand that they can't really do anything to you. At that moment, I was scared mainly because it was unexpected, but when I fell asleep, I wasn't afraid at all. By the way, we had a heartfelt conversation, as I remember. I hope that person will come back. There were several events. The first one happened in 2002 or 2003. I don't remember exactly, maybe even in 2004, more likely in that year. In those years, I lived in the tundra, the son of hereditary reindeer herders. The event unfolded in August when we were on summer pastures, at one of our regular stops called Goldsofka near the lake. In the evening, I and another comrade decided to go fishing. As we fished, it began to get dark. I lowered the fishing rod and started saying, "Catch the big and small fish, of course." It may seem like a pun, but it really happened. And then a person, or something very similar, emerged from the lake in front of us. A dark figure looked at us, with a head sticking out of the water. It seemed that this entity was just having fun, surfacing with such a splash. We were 10 years old at the time. We screamed and ran away towards the camp. When I got home, I shouted loudly, "Mom, Mom, there's a water spirit," but no one paid attention. The next day, we organized a whole expedition to this place with other kids, taking stones and sticks with us. We threw stones into the lake and poked sticks into the water. Of course, we didn't find anything, but none of the adults believed us. Another event occurred in 2011. At that time, I lived in a village and was walking home from relatives on one side of the village. My path passed by 2 cemeteries, old and new. It was October. At 11 o'clock at night, I decided to take a shortcut along the road that went directly past the old cemetery towards the new one. I was walking. Everything was quiet when the silhouette of an old woman in black clothes and a black scarf appeared in front of me. Of course, it was scary to walk there, but I was not afraid of the old woman and gave her way. Only when I got home did I start to think about all that had happened. My thoughts were like this: so, an old woman, 2 cemeteries, almost midnight, something strange. Anyway, when she passed by, my inner feeling told me to give way and not to worry. The third case happened in April 2022. I worked as an electrician in an apartment building when the power went out. The electrical panel was located in the basement, at the very far end. It was a dry and spacious basement, but for some reason it was always unpleasant to be there, and not only I noticed it, but also the cleaner. I arrived, went down to the basement around 9 p.m. There was no emergency lighting with EOPS, so I had a headlamp on me. Opening the electrical panel, I checked the power at the input and noticed with the corner of my eye a silhouette of a person in the doorway. Shining the flashlight, this silhouette disappeared. Making sure there was no power at the input, I quickly made my way to the exit. Of course, I had to be in that basement later, and it was always scary. I must say, I'm not a witness to this story, but under certain circumstances, I have no doubt about its truthfulness. The story began in one of the apartments in Yakutsk. 4 guys and 2 girls were discussing the movie they had just seen, the Blair Witch coursework from the other world. Some held the opinion that everything they had seen was nonsense, while others argued that such things could well happen in reality. It would have ended there if one of the defenders of the film hadn't suggested making their own movie on a similar theme. Like there are plenty of unclean places in Yakutia, and maybe they, unlike the guys in the movie, would truly capture all sorts of monsters and ghosts. The idea appealed to everyone. They immediately started discussing the technical side of the project, and by the time they dispersed, an expedition with its own budget, 2 video cameras, and enthusiastic participants had already been formed. The only thing was, nobody knew a genuinely scary place. But they decided that wouldn't be a problem since they had an acquaintance, a native of a village, who had mentioned several times in conversations that there were cursed places in his homeland. But then a problem arose. The acquaintance flatly refused to take the guys to these places. He believed in curses and was terrified. Numerous pleas had no effect. He said that if they were such fools as to voluntarily risk their lives, they should do it without his help. According to Yakut beliefs, the curse of spirits can affect fate, and if someone or something powerful sends a curse, it can affect all future generations. The refusal of the acquaintance further agitated the guys. Since there was no reliable information, they began to search for the place themselves. Nikolai, Roman, Pavel, and Misha decided to see the venture through to the end. They decided to go to the Ulis where their acquaintance came from and find out about the places where spirits dwell. Said and done. A week later, they were already on a ferry heading towards Nizhny Bestyak. The destination was about 200 kilometers from the city. Arriving in the village of N, the guys, calling themselves history students, spent the night with the locals. The girls, let's call them Vera and Nadia, who stayed with one old lady, came to the guys in the morning with news that they knew places where evil spirits abound. The old lady they stayed with turned out to be quite fond of strong drinks and hinted to the girls that it wouldn't hurt to leave a bottle for her hospitality, which the girls did. The tipsy old lady turned out to be unusually talkative and, between stories about her husband, who died 20 years ago, and complaints about the local administration head, mentioned a place where there was an old abandoned house called Yotiak, where evil forces dwelled. So, the shooting location was found. All that remained was to find a guide. Again, a problem nobody wanted to hire as a guide. But the old lady urged the girls not to go there, regretting that she had told them about this house, thus sowing seeds of doubt in the girls' minds. However, the guys quickly restored their spirits. By the way, all this time one of them was constantly recording everything on camera, mimicking the Blair Witch movie. In the evening, near the market, a guy with a fairly battered face approached the guys and offered his services as a guide for 15 bottles of vodka. The guys were surprised by the excessively large size of the fee, and they started bargaining. The guy, who introduced himself as Vasya, after negotiations agreed to 10 bottles but demanded an advance of 5 bottles immediately. This Saturday night was scarier than any horror movie. The entire male population of the village got drunk, and the street resembled an arena where a free-for-all fight was taking place. The film crew didn't sleep all night. They feared for themselves and for the guide, who came to them for a new bottle covered in blood and with a torn shirt. In general, the fears began long before the spirits appeared. In the morning, the guide Vasya said he changed his mind. explaining his refusal by saying that the elders forbade him from assisting in this sinful event. The expedition was on the brink of collapse. Some began to lean towards the idea of returning to the city. It seemed to be the only way out of the situation. As one of the project participants later said, and it was the most correct. They were getting ready to go back when the situation suddenly changed drastically. Vasya came back with the words, "I don't give a damn about those old geezers, and pour quickly before I change my mind." As it turned out, the elders promised to pay him if he backed out of this venture, and apparently they kept their word. A couple of hours later, they were already on their way. Mosquitoes were bothering them badly despite generously applying repellent to their skin. Vasya kept reaching for the bottle all the time and demanded that they better remember the way, because the guys would have to return on their own. Everyone's mood was uplifted. The guys joked, the girls laughed. Only Vasya was gloomier than a cloud and occasionally cursed the old folks. Apparently his conscience was bothering him. After 4 hours, they reached a clearing called Alas with a small black spot in the middle, which was the very Yoiok here. Vasya said goodbye to everyone, took the remainder of his fee and left. The dwelling was clean and untouched. Judging by the layer of dust, no one had entered since the October Revolution. A teapot stood on a 3-legged table. Birch bark dishes lay on the shelves, cracked. The scene could be called dull, but not frightening. The girls started dusting. The guys went for firewood and water. After a while, the Yotiok took on a completely inhabited look. A bouquet of flowers on the table, a fire in the stove, music playing from the tape recorder. It was getting dark. When one of the guys decided to feed the fire according to the Yakut custom, he was advised not to do so, saying that the spirits would get offended. For the same reason, they increased the volume of the cassette player, playing dance music. Soon they noticed that everyone fell silent and listened to the music in a strange hypnotic trance. They started to talk loudly, but quickly fell silent again. The conversation didn't flow. Suddenly a scream rang out. "Turn off the music," Vera shouted. Covering her ears, she rolled around on the earthen floor in hysteria. Nadia tried to calm her down, but without success. Suddenly the music quieted down on its own. The tape and the cassette player got chewed up. They went to sleep, but no one could fall asleep. Somewhere after an hour, footsteps were heard outside the wall. Someone circled around, stumbling, the dwelling but didn't enter, instead went around again. It felt like this someone was looking for the door but couldn't find it. "Who's there?" Kolya asked, but no one answered. "Vasya, is that you?" Pavel remembered about the guide. He was met with silence too. After the third circle, the footsteps receded towards the forest. Roma, taking the camera, headed towards the exit, but then the girl started screaming for him not to open the door. Vera was on the verge of hysteria again. Nevertheless, Roma went out with the camera, and the door slammed shut behind him. The remaining ones inside began to discuss what to do next. They decided to feed the fire and ask forgiveness from the spirits. They began to prepare for the ritual, but then the door burst open with a bang, and Roma appeared on the threshold. "I filmed it. It's chasing me." At the same time, he grinned strangely and stared wildly. I filmed it, he muttered continuously. The girls started crying. What happened next? No one remembered clearly. Fragments of memories that survived among the expedition members diverge. They returned to the village the next evening. Roman had a stomach ache and was dizzy. The guys were given sedatives and sent by bus to Nizhny Bestyak, while Roman stayed in the local hospital. All the video footage was demagnetized, and one video camera turned out to be broken. In the city, the once very friendly group fell apart. They no longer gathered together. Half a year later, Roman attempted suicide, and now he is on the P&D register. Nikolay, who used to be a very sociable guy, became withdrawn. The guide Vasya, according to rumors, died a month after that incident. Grandpa told me this story. And Grandpa is a man of his word. If he says something, he promises to do it as soon as possible. And if you have to wait, it's just a little bit. In my childhood, he constantly brought me various toys, told stories, and we laughed together until we dropped. And I even liked his laughter. It was so clear. Unlike the laughter of old people usually is, more like that of a young person. I grew up and I started visiting him in the village less often. School, various activities, new technologies, and then, the summer before last, I told my mom that I wanted to visit Grandpa and Grandma. I hadn't seen them for so long, the city had completely consumed me. And Grandma cooks so well. They also have their own livestock, cows, chickens, goats, everything is their own. And I was drawn to the fresh air. Packed my things, Mom called Grandpa in the evening to come for me. I was sitting on pins and needles. I still knew the local kids well. We told each other stories. Sometimes I retold Grandpa's stories. We climbed old barns, went to the abandoned house where, according to village legend, spirits dwelled. We got scared back then when a mouse ran by. A girl noticed movement out of the corner of her eye, and as it darted away, she screamed, and we all jumped up like we were shot in the backside. It's been 7 or 8 years since then, no less. I went out onto the balcony and saw Grandpa's old Moskvich approaching. Well, I had a smile from ear to ear. You could sew all 32 teeth to it. I grabbed my bag, kissed my mom and dad, and dashed out onto the street. And Grandpa had already parked the car, the old Moskvich, but it sparkled in the sun as if it were brand new, and Grandpa stood there, leaning against the door, smiling. I ran up, hugged him, sat in the front, buckled up, and off we went. I started asking about the village, the neighbors, how the farm was doing. Grandpa eagerly answered my barrage of questions, patiently, with a smile, happy to see his grandson after all. We had already left the city limits when I asked about my best village friend, Fyodor. We were really close back then, inseparable. We even fell in love with the same girl once, but we decided to leave her and not change our friendship, so to speak, brotherhood over a girl. Grandpa immediately frowned, gripped the steering wheel tighter, and became darker than a storm cloud. Well, I understood then that something was wrong. I decided to keep silent, not to ask. I'll find out on my own, and Grandpa started. I'll write down his words. Fedka was a good guy, very young, but it's a pity for him. Only 17 years old, he's a year older than me. He never got into trouble. His parents went to the city on business, leaving him at home with the task of keeping the house clean. He was diligent, never slacked off. I would barely wake up, and he was already up, shouting across the yard, "Good morning, Grandpa Kolya." He kept the cow clean, milked her, and herded the sheep to pasture, looking after them. But then he decided to clean the well once. It was always overgrown with algae, moss, various mushrooms growing at the bottom. He took some stick, wrapped a cloth around it, and started scrubbing the walls and bottom. He cleared it and started scooping with a bucket. He almost reached the bottom when he noticed something down there. It looked like some kind of cloth or something. He got curious about what it might be. He tied a hook to the stick and pulled it up. It turned out to be a skeleton, not an animal's, but a human's. The boy didn't bother to report to his father to properly bury the body. Instead, he brought it into his house. I saw him cleaning the well sometimes. Grandma would exclaim in astonishment that he bent down so low, he might fall. I got worried too, and decided to visit. Grandma had made pancakes. I grabbed a bunch and went to him. I went into the barn, no one there, and the cow was almost knee-deep in manure, her udder swollen, as if her milk hadn't been milked. I suspected that something was wrong, so I ran to his house faster. Knocking. I heard some movement inside, but as soon as I knocked, everything fell silent. I almost broke down the door and fell to the floor. It turned out it wasn't even locked. And the house smelled of something dead, swear to God. I got scared, fearing someone had hurt the boy, so I checked all the rooms and found him lying on the floor in the living room. The smell was strongest there. I thought Fedor was gone. I grabbed him by the shoulder, and he opened his eyes wide with dark circles underneath. His face was sunken, barely moving his hands, but his eyes were lively, as if they had become even brighter. Green, sparkling, about to ignite sparks. Fedka was a handsome guy, but here he looked tired, emaciated, like he aged 10 years. I tried to help him stand up, but he couldn't stand. He just mumbled something, legs, legs, legs. That's when I realized his legs weren't moving at all. Must have been paralyzed. I thought maybe he was sick with something, so I sat him in his chair and started asking questions. But he wouldn't look at me, kept averting his gaze, staring into the corner, on the verge of delirium. And when he looked away again, I saw where he was trying to look. Bones were lying in the corner, and Fedor raised his hand and pointed there. I got up from my crouch, thinking I should go there, but he grabbed my hand with such force that he almost knocked me to the floor. But he kept poking. Well, I pulled my hand away, put a chair in the corner, and put him there. I had to lift him with my other hand and barely dragged him. His legs wouldn't move, so he dragged them on the floor. I sat him down there and decided to go to his wife, let her feed the poor guy. I went to Grandma and heard Fedka babbling something, so lively, chattering away like with a girl, promising something, but as soon as we walked in, he fell silent. So Lenachka, that's Grandma's name, kept bringing him food and feeding him. And one time she says, she comes in and almost screams. He's crawling near the door, grabbing something with his hand, and there's some torn cloth in his hand. He wouldn't let it go, almost bit her when she tried to help him up. But she's not a timid woman. She scolded him, and as soon as he stopped, she dragged him into the living room. The guy lost a lot of weight, became as thin as a twig, so it's no wonder his grandma carried him away. It was terrifying for her in the house. She felt someone's presence and decided to look in the corner again, where the bones were, but they weren't there. I thought I had finally thrown them away, but I hadn't touched them. It seemed as if these remains were the only motivation for Fedka to live. I felt terribly sorry for him. Once at night, I went out to the porch to smoke and saw a girl in the window of the Fedorovs' house. She was so beautiful that I thought I must be dreaming. And the main thing was, Fedya was smiling, saying something to her, and the girl was swirling around the room, her hair almost down to her feet, so light like hers. The moonlight seemed to pass through her. The next day the guy died. He crawled out of the chair again and went to the kitchen, and they found him embracing some rags resembling a dress with a pile of bones. I was stunned. My friend, whom I probably knew better than myself, died for some mystical reason. I got chills. Only 2 kilometers left to the village, so I just stared into the horizon where the mountain peaks crashed. It felt disgusting, cold and empty inside, and Grandpa was silent. He didn't want to disturb, leaving me alone with my thoughts, apparently regretting that he had told me the whole truth. That same evening I went to Ira, the girl I had known since childhood, who had turned into a real woman. And she said that she heard from her grandmother that a girl in the house where Fed's family lived had taken her own life because no one proposed to her, so she threw herself into the well. And before that, no one had apparently dug up the bones. The well had never been cleaned so deeply. Fedor's parents moved to the city, didn't sell the house, left it as a memory. So one evening I stayed at Ira's until late at night, almost midnight, and my way home passed by my friend's house. I stopped, remembered everything about him, and couldn't remember anything bad when I noticed in the window that Fedor was smiling, not thin, but rather strong, holding the girl around the waist, as if in a waltz. And his eyes were sparkling green, just like before. They were swirling around the room, and I stared in horror at all of this, and then ran home. I couldn't sleep for a long time, and 3 days later I left. It was the end of August. I had to get ready for school. But I remember the story well, and I will never forget my best friend. That's the story. We've got some devilry going on with our house. We live outside the city. Our parents sold one apartment after moving in together and bought a private house. It's not particularly new. It's already about 40 years old. Everything in the house is fine, except the basement was creepy. The wiring there constantly shorted out, so there was no light there. It always smelled musty, sometimes even rotten. We found a bunch of dead mice there, and sometimes even rats, but we attributed it all to them falling in, unable to get out, and dying of hunger. The basement was like a perfect concrete box. Everything was tightly sealed, no holes, so if an animal got in there, it was definitely without a chance of getting out. Our cat somehow fell in there once, and she was howling like crazy until we got her out. She clearly couldn't jump out herself. By the way, there are two entrances to the basement, a hatch in the kitchen under the table. We don't use it, so there were no stairs from it, and another hatch in the hallway. At first, we started storing food and old clothes in the basement, but the food spoiled quickly, and the things got damp and turned into junk. Mom thought it was because of mold, which had spread on the walls due to the lack of ventilation. Anyway, when we were changing the flooring, we decided we didn't need that basement. We didn't fill it with concrete, just put a new floor on top in all the rooms, without any hatches, so the basement was firmly sealed. We came back a week after the flooring was done, put the furniture back, and went to bed in the evening. Parents slept on the second floor, and I on the first. And then, in my sleep, I hear some scraping noise, as if someone is dragging something metallic like a knife or a nail along the stone. A long, continuous sound. Sometimes it seemed distant at first. I even thought it was outside. We have enough alcoholic neighbors, so who knows what they're up to. And then it sounded very close. And then I woke up. I realized the sound was coming from my room. I sat up in bed, looking into the darkness, and at the same time I really wanted to close my eyes, cover myself with a blanket, and cowardly pretend that nothing was happening. But the sound was definitely in my room. Only a couple of seconds later, I realized it was coming from the basement. It's as if someone is dragging something metallic along the basement ceiling. The height of the basement is about 2 meters, so you need to be either very tall or have something like a stick to scratch the ceiling like that. I got scared. I turned on the light. The sound continued, only now it was coming from the other end of the house. The basement was almost continuous, except for the supporting pillars in 2 places. And until 5 in the morning, someone was scratching there, and I sat there, feeling like a little girl afraid to get out of bed or turn off the light. In the morning, I told my parents. They laughed at first, but I was pretty convincing, so my dad decided to spend the night in the living room on the couch on the first floor to prove that I just made it all up. At 12:30 at night, the scratching returned. Now it was definitely doing some fancy skating on the ceiling down there. And sometimes you could distinctly hear something metallic hitting the concrete. Dad was braver, so he even lay his ear to the floor. He said the sound was definitely coming from the basement. We started thinking, what could it be? And how to get it out. We even thought that maybe somehow a drunk neighbor fell there. We didn't notice him, and now he's suffering. But we were away for a week after the work was finished. He wouldn't have survived there. Breaking the floor open would cost a lot of money. And I have to admit, no one wanted to check what was scratching there. Anyway, now I try to go there less often. I prefer to live in an apartment in the city. And Dad says it goes berserk every night from below for the 2nd month already. Moreover, when Dad sleeps there alone, he's a brave man. Seriously, it starts even not in the deep of the night, sometimes already around 8, or is it because it gets dark early? Dad also thinks that it's in one corner, under a big old wardrobe. It scratches there especially often, as if gradually making its way up. End of June. All exams are over. Got the diploma. Time to relax. Me and 4 of my classmates pooled a fairly large sum of money, loaded up the car and headed to the countryside to Grandpa's. The village of O was in the Tomsk region, about 230 km from the city. So we arrived. My friend's grandmother, let's call him N, welcomed us quite warmly. We arrived around 8 to 9 in the evening. Before that, we called Grandpa and he heated up the sauna. Oh, how I remember it was good. Steamed. We decided to have some beer outdoors. So we sat and chatted for about 40 minutes. Our eternal conversation about the beautiful was interrupted by a wild scream, about 200 meters away from us. Soon, somewhat stunned, we began to make out in this piercing scream a blissful curse, and it was a female voice. Suddenly, we all jumped up and ran into the house to tell Grandma. She said not to pay attention because one old lady had lost her mind. But my heart was still uneasy, and so it repeated every night. One day I went to the well for water, and before me stood an old woman, about 50 meters tall, with a terrifying face and a menacingly half-crazy smile. Returning home with 2 buckets of icy water, I described this old woman to Grandma, and she said it was that crazy one. Sometime later, me and N slept in the barn right by the door. It's stuffy in the summer, and it's a bit cooler near the door. 2 more guys slept in the anteroom. Grandma and Grandpa were lying in the hall. I remember they were sleeping pretty soundly because we were fixing a motorcycle at 3 in the morning. Not a peep. The doors to the yard were closed from both sides, but that evening we didn't close them from behind, as we had had a lot of beer and everyone was running around to relieve themselves. So there we were, sleeping peacefully. I was having a beautiful dream. Suddenly I heard get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, get up, and N. Scream. Opening my eyes, not understanding anything, I only made out the silhouette of the old woman. And N. In the corner, knees pulled up, yelling, "Why should I get up?" She chuckled maliciously, stepped into the doorway, grabbed her axe, and turning around, said, "We'll be chopping your head off." I was in shock and horror. N grabbed a boot and, yelling "Get lost" with all his might, threw it at the old lady's head. She fell down, got up and said, "We'll meet again," and ran off. That night we didn't sleep anymore. And from then on, we locked all the doors. The next morning we told everyone what happened. N.'s grandma said that this old woman used to be a witch, and maybe she still is. This didn't add any joy to us. Then Grandma told us the following story. When N was a little boy, he often spent his summers here. And once, at the age of 7 or 8, he was eating a piece of freshly baked bread on the street. This old woman approached him and asked him for a little bit. Of course, he didn't give her any. "Such a delicious treat," she said. Then, "Well, son, we'll meet again." The next morning, we were in shock. N had 3 knife marks on his neck and a stripe from his chin to his chest. We treated the cuts. No one said anything. N was the most horrified of all. But I'm sure that everyone, including N.'s ancestors, understood that it was all about that old woman. We left. Sometime in October, he started having problems with his thyroid gland, and before New Year's, he ended up in cardiology. Although, in principle, the guy is fine and finished the first year well. A nightmarish tragedy that shook the whole of Japan in November 1988, a group of underage boys. For several weeks, they forcibly kept the unfortunate girl in a house belonging to the parents of one of the intruders. The kidnappers, by threats and torture, forced Furuta to make a phone call to her parents and inform them that she had run away from home and they should not look for her. The girl lied to her parents that she was at a friend's house. The criminals also demanded that in the presence of the adult owners of the house, Furuta said that she was the girlfriend of one of the guys. However, this was not required. The adults did not call the police even after the unfortunate woman personally begged them for help. The boy's parents remained impassive to her pleas, fearing retaliation from Hiroshi Miyano, who had Yakuza connections. Even the Nazi executioners could envy the sophistication of the young Japanese atrocities. The boys constantly raped the girl, brutally beat her with improvised objects including rods and golf clubs, threw heavy dumbbells on her stomach, burned different parts of her body with cigarettes, introduced various foreign objects, forced to drink urine and eat insects, inserted fireworks into the anus and set them on fire, cut her nipples with a knife. Screaming, moaning, and pleading had no effect on them, but only made them even more angry. The long list of all the abuse shocked even experienced police officers. One of the worst burns was inflicted on her in retaliation for trying to call the police on the phone. After a while, the high school girl's wounds became so painful that, according to one of her abusers, the unfortunate victim spent more than an hour barely crawling down the stairs just to use the bathroom. And her tormentors watched and laughed. The perpetrators said that many of their friends knew that Junko Furuta was in that house, but the police never managed to find out whether these people had been in the house of torture, and whether they took part in the torture of the schoolgirl. The girl repeatedly begged the guys to spare her and kill her to end her torture, but the cruel sadists were not going to lose their favorite toy so easily. On January 4th, 1989, the criminals, annoyed at losing a mahjong game, brutally beat her with a steel barbell and subjected her to nightmarish abuse before pouring lighter fluid on her body and setting her on fire. The girl's body could not bear the torture and Junko Furuta died of painful shock. The day after her death, the young executioners placed her tortured body in a barrel, poured cement mortar over it, and dumped it in a construction site near Tokyo's Kodo district. In Japan, this horrifying tragedy was called the case of the murder and cementing of a high school girl. The perpetrators could not escape arrest. The girl's body was found, and the sadists were apprehended. According to the requirements of the Japanese juvenile justice system, at first their names were not disclosed, but the weekly Japanese publication Shukan Bunshin was not afraid of possible consequences and published the personal data of the killers, arguing that human rights do not apply to cattle. At the trial, the perverts partially pleaded guilty to inflicting bodily harm, resulting in the death of the victim, but refused to plead guilty to premeditated murder, claiming that they did not realize how much their victim was suffering. It seemed to them that she was only pretending. Taking into account all the circumstances of the case and the provisions of the Japanese Criminal Code, in July 1990, the court handed down sentences ranging from 4 to 17 years in prison. The parents of the girl were dissatisfied with the decision of the judges. It seemed to them not severe enough, and tried to challenge it. Unfortunately, they failed. Hiroshi Miyano was recognized as the leader of a gang of thugs. He served 17 years, later changing his name to Hiroshi Yokoyama. G. Ogura was recognized as his first mate and spent 8 years in a juvenile prison. He was released in August 1999 and changed his name to G. Kamisaku Jo Kamisaku. However, Kamisaku was not able to stay free for long, and in 2004, he went back to prison for 7 years for beating up his friend who allegedly stole his girlfriend. The terrible story of Junko Furuta has not been forgotten. 2 movies were made in Japan about this tragedy, and a popular Japanese band dedicated a song to the deceased. At the age of 12, I often used to come to my grandmother's village in the summer. My parents would bring me, have tea, and leave me for a week or 2. It wasn't as nice in the city as it was in the village, especially since I had long since made friends who also came here from the city. And in the village there was a river, berries, flowers, cows, beauty. We would walk around the village until late at night. Time flew by like crazy. The sea of impressions completely killed my vigilance, or at least caution, but in vain. It was already midnight when we came to our senses and started heading home. Pitch darkness fell over the village. Only a few lanterns dimly lit the way. My grandmother's house turned out to be the farthest from this place, which didn't make me happy at all. I had to walk past houses with blacked out windows, past the dark thicket of the forest, past the mysterious river. I was already angry with myself for staying out so long, but there was nothing to be done. I had to go. Nobody walks around the village at such a time, and I continued my journey in complete solitude. In the darkness, familiar things changed their appearance. The bushes where we picked raspberries in the morning became dark and scary. It seemed as if someone had hidden in them and was watching me, and then they would jump out and tear me to 1,000 tiny pieces. But while it waits for me to panic, for me to be scared, but I'm not scared. Deciding to annoy the monster, I put on a big smile and sang "Let's Walk Together Merrily." Oh God, how creepy this song sounded in the dead of night. I scared myself with the effect produced and fell silent. And then I dashed forward. I wasn't thinking anymore, I was just scared. But luckily for me, someone's figure flickered in the distance. I was about to run towards it, but then stopped. Something wasn't right. I could already make out that it was Aunt Glasha. Aunt Glasha was the most unpopular person in the village, although she was friends with me and my grandmother. The rest simply hated her. Grandma refused to tell me why, but the kids told such a story. Once upon a time, Aunt Glasha went to another village, and there she got pregnant. As she herself said, she was forced into it, but no one believed her. We live in a developed time, but back then it was awful to get pregnant out of wedlock. And it was still unknown who the father was. But the worst began when the child was born. Misfortune started happening in the village. Fires, cattle died, children fell ill. Someone noticed that misfortunes only came to those houses where Aunt Glasha and her baby came, and where she was mistreated. Some started to fear Aunt Glasha after that, and some began to hate her. They could have killed her and the baby if they had been given the chance. But they didn't have to. Aunt Glasha killed the baby herself. She cried, saying it was the devil's child. She was hated even more, although the misfortunes did stop. Since then, Aunt Glasha became an outcast. That's how she lived, unloved by anyone and persecuted by everyone. It wasn't strange for her to walk at night. She didn't like people's sideways glances. But still, it scared me. I stopped in indecision. But the woman noticed me herself and waved her hand, smiling so widely that I felt sick. I got even more scared, and I didn't even have the strength to smile back. But this didn't bother her at all. She beckoned me with her hand. I was ready to go in the opposite direction, but something seemed to make me approach her. And it wasn't my conscience at all. Approaching her, I sensed a strange smell emanating from Aunt Glasha. It both frightened and surprised me. Nothing smelled like that in the village. Here, it smelled like milk, hay, flowers, but definitely not like this smell. It was very synthetic. It's the kind of smell you find in doctors' offices. I really didn't like that smell, so I decided not to get closer than a meter. Auntie kept smiling. Finally, she said, "Hello, Nadia. How big you've grown. How big you've grown." Then she opened her mouth wide, and I saw 2 rows of beautiful, gleaming white fangs, each about 2 centimeters long. That's when I realized I could now forget about conscience and tear my claws out. Aunt Glasha lunged forward with her hand, as if trying to grab me, but I dodged and ran away. This creature ran with a good, unnatural speed for an old woman, but as the city champion in track and field, she wouldn't have caught up with me. And I was running even faster than I do in competitions. I reached Grandma's house in about 20 seconds. I burst into the house and immediately started locking all the locks. Then I threw myself into Grandma's arms, sobbing. A few seconds later, something hit the door. Then there was a howl from outside and some sounds like "Let's walk together merrily." "How big you've grown." Grandma immediately crossed herself and recited a prayer. The howling stopped and everything fell silent. Grandma cautiously peeked into the yard, but there was nothing there anymore. Then she started to calm me down. It turned out Aunt Glasha was no longer alive. My devout grandmother said I was being frightened by demons. In the morning, she took me to church. The priest was surprised that I hadn't brought a cross with me, afraid of losing it, so he gave me a cross from the church shop for free. Then he also recited an akathist to the Virgin Mary. He gave me a prayer to recite if I ever saw Aunt Glasha again. For the rest of my vacation in the village, I returned home before it got dark. And on the last day, as I was leaving, I saw Aunt Glasha's polka dot dress in the distance. But after crossing myself, I saw nothing anymore. Good day. I'm sharing this story not to delve into mysticism, but perhaps someone has experienced something similar and it might help shed light on what it was. I apologize in advance for the reserved language. It's a result of professionalism and, yes, the absence of any literary talent. So to the story. It all happened in 2009. It was a spring day, a weekend, and I had arranged to meet a friend near the circus, a fairly crowded area in our city. On the way there, passing by the city court building, I heard someone call my name. Turning around, I saw my former college classmate Irina Shinko, known in our college as a daredevil and a lively soul. We used to be very close, skipping classes together and living the typical, fun student life. By the way, I dropped out of college in my second year, realizing it wasn't for me, and enrolled in a university where a new student life and new acquaintances took over. As fate would have it, I hardly communicated with former classmates. Later, thanks to classmates, I met up with some, but the close-knit camaraderie was no longer there. So back to Irina. Naturally, we were thrilled to meet, so we stepped aside to smoke and chat about how everyone was doing. We discussed our former classmates, naming names and talking about where everyone ended up after college. I was the one asking most of the questions, and Irina was answering. I'll clarify right away that there was no mysticism involved. I was talking to an ordinary, cheerful person, the Irina I knew from college, who hadn't changed much since then. Even her hairstyle remained almost the same, just a bit grown out and dyed. After chatting for about 15 minutes, I said I was running late and had to go. We exchanged numbers, agreeing to call each other soon and meet up. As I was practically running away, I asked her who she was waiting for here, considering it was the courthouse. Irina replied that she had come with her older brother, who had gone to court with a summons, saying it was nothing serious and he would be released soon. About 7 to 10 days after our meeting, I was contacted through the same classmates where I received the terrible news of the death of another classmate of ours, Svetlana. An accident during the May holidays. In shock, I tried to call Irina and tell her about it, but the subscriber is unavailable. After meeting up with everyone at the funeral, I asked about Irina, to which I was told that she would be a little late because she was waiting for her husband to take care of their child. To my surprise, my classmates told me that she had been married for a couple of years and was happy in her marriage. Okay, a few minutes before the farewell began, Irina appeared, and I saw a completely different person. No, it was her, but she had changed a lot. Long dark hair, and at that time, hair extensions were quite an expensive luxury that not everyone could afford. A beautiful figure, and her gaze, was that tired look of someone who has experienced family life. Someone who's married. I think you'll understand me. The Irina I had seen danced mischievous sparks in her eyes. After contemplating during the funeral service and after the eulogy, I finally approached Irina and directly asked her why she didn't remember our recent meeting, as it had been less than 2 weeks since then. They looked at me like I was crazy and said that the last time we saw each other was about 5 years ago. I was even more shocked and presented my final argument. I mentioned her older brother, who was either picking her up or dropping off the summons. To which Irina responded with irritation that her brother had been inside for about 3 years now. With that, she turned around and walked away. I don't know what she thought, but after what happened, I didn't seek any more reasons to meet up. A couple of times afterward, I tried calling that number, but it was unavailable, so I deleted it. I'll clarify right away, I don't take drugs. Alcohol only in moderate amounts and only on holidays. I still can't understand who I met by the courthouse that day. I couldn't have mistaken the conversation, as specific people and events were mentioned that only our rowdy student gang could have known, and I wasn't the only one asking questions. This story is absolutely real. Sorry for the long narrative, but without describing many facts, it loses all meaning. I was very young and don't remember anything. I'm writing this based on my parents' accounts. When I was just born, we lived in a one-room apartment. After my birth, my parents decided it was time to expand our living space so that I could have my own room, and they could have a separate bedroom. They started looking for a 2-room apartment in our area and stumbled upon an ad for a lovely 2-bedroom apartment in a nice neighborhood. The apartment was being sold by a mysterious single woman with a surname that sounded posh. My parents really liked the apartment, and after talking to this woman, they decided to swap apartments with additional payment. While they were finalizing the paperwork, this woman behaved, to say the least, strangely. She showered my mom with compliments and tried to touch her face, like patting her cheek, etc. Moreover, my mom was wearing a black charm ring at that time. This woman grabbed my mom's hand, examined the ring, and talked about her interest in esoterics and various kinds of witchcraft. In general, she behaved unusually and constantly hovered around my mom. Although my parents were unsettled by her behavior, they shrugged it off. People can be eccentric, and besides, they really liked the apartment. In the end, the deal was successfully concluded. We moved our things, did some cosmetic repairs in the new apartment, and started living there. During the renovation, my mom found a bunch of needles stuck in the walls of the apartment all around the perimeter of the rooms. However, she didn't worry about it at the time, as she didn't believe in mysticism. She pulled out those needles with her bare hands and threw them away. From that moment on, my mom suddenly began to experience terrible quincus edema. It mainly affected her face. Sometimes her lips swelled up, and other times her eyes were completely swollen shut. My mom went to doctors, took tests, underwent examinations, but they found nothing wrong with her. According to the tests, she was perfectly healthy, and all the doctors diagnosed her with an allergic reaction of unknown origin, prescribing antihistamines, and that was it. By the way, my mom's charm ring, after the witch examined it, burst right on her finger a few days later. She also mentioned that she was always afraid to wash her face. It felt like someone was standing behind her, but only in the bathroom. There was no such feeling in other parts of the apartment. It was funny, of course, and she laughed at herself internally, scolding herself for being impressionable, but she washed her eyes one by one, first soaping one, rinsing it off, then the other, just to be on the safe side. In general, my mom suffered from edema for a while. During that period, she was back in the hospital, in the ward, and following the advice of some acquaintances, she and my dad went to visit an old lady who healed people. This granny instructed them to look for a bewitched iron thing in the apartment. The next evening, my mom came home from the hospital and fell asleep. She had been given allergy medications in the hospital, so she constantly fell asleep from them. It was already evening, around 9 o'clock, and it was dark outside. For the second day in a row, my dad had been rummaging through the entire apartment in search of the bewitched iron thing until he found something metallic in the threshold of the bathroom. He carefully extracted this thing, which turned out to be some oddly tangled wire, from under the wooden threshold. One piece of wire was wound around another piece, which in turn was intertwined with a third piece, and so on. He took it with pliers and went to burn it on the kitchen stove over a regular gas burner. Here comes the doorbell, which woke Mom up. She heard Dad go to the vestibule, talk to someone, close all the doors, and walk into the kitchen a couple of minutes later. Mom went to him and asked what happened, who came in the middle of the night. Dad told her that he found the piece of iron the witch mentioned, started burning it, and heard the doorbell. He went out, and there was the disheveled witch who sold them the apartment. She asked if they had a spare key to the old apartment, and tried to push past Dad into the apartment. Dad said they didn't have any spare keys, closed the door in her face, and went back to burn the wire. It's strange that the woman, although she bought the old one-room apartment in the same city, lived in another city and rented out this apartment. Buses between the cities didn't run at this time, and she didn't have a car. Maybe it's a coincidence, maybe something happened in the old apartment. I don't know. Anyway, Dad burned the wire as much as he could and threw it away. The next day, the parents went to the grandmother healer again. She poured water into a 3-liter jar, looked into it, and chuckled, "Oh, you've roasted the cursed witch. She flew to you in the middle of the night." At the same time, the parents didn't even have time to tell her what had happened. They just nodded and agreed, still in shock. The grandmother gave Mom enchanted water, told her to drink it a little bit every day and wash her face, and all the swellings would go away. Mom diligently followed all the grandmother's orders, and the swellings soon disappeared as suddenly as they appeared. Since then, there have been no more swellings, just as there were none before they met that strange woman witch. The apartment became quieter. There was no longer any fear of being in the bathroom. I don't know what it was, whether the medicines helped Mom or the grandmother's water. And was that woman really to blame for the unrest in the apartment and Mom's swelling? Maybe it's all just coincidences. But that grandmother healer really looked into ordinary tap water poured into a jar and accurately told the parents everything that happened to them yesterday. She couldn't have known that. The parents think it was something strange and unexplainable, and I believe them. We all have hobbies. There's what we do for money, and there's what we really like. Some take stunning photographs, some disappear into online games at night, some compose music in their free time. One of my hobbies is collecting horror stories. Well, not exactly horror stories, more like interesting and well-presented tales. It's just that there are more of them among horror stories. I'm thrilled by the storytelling and narrative structure in Black Ops. I'm amazed at how skillfully Inception fools the viewer, but my personal top 10 is consistently occupied by stories about the frightening, unknown, and often inexplicable. Why? I don't know. Perhaps because often the storyteller doesn't give a straightforward answer to the main intrigue of their story. Perhaps because with the last words, they sometimes tear down the fourth wall, turning a seemingly banal story into something truly terrifying. For a more immersive experience, you can choose a suitable setting read at night with the lights off, alone. No matter what, it's hard to believe right away that after going through a horror story, the protagonist starts receiving calls from the number that was in the game, or that he saw something really strange while bored on the night shift. It's a completely different matter when you hear the story in person, from the person sitting in front of you. 2 years ago, I was hired as a freelance programmer by one person. We communicated exclusively by phone and chat, but soon there were so many questions about the project that we had to arrange a personal meeting. The employer, let's call him Mikhail, turned out to be one of those people who really want to appear tough at first glance, but quickly drop this facade as soon as they get a good impression of you. Sitting in a cafe in the city center, we discussed his project, talked about life, about people, about how there are so few honest workers now. In passing, I casually mentioned my hobby. For a second, he changed his expression, now I understand why, but he didn't show it, and continued the conversation in a joking, friendly manner. Only from time to time did he nervously bite his lip, absent-mindedly staring at his cup of tea. And finally, he made up his mind. "So, you collect stories?" Yeah, I nodded, surprised by this turn of the conversation. Mikhail took out a cigarette but immediately put it back, catching a sideways glance from the salesperson behind the counter. "This happened 17 years ago," he began, "when I still had a best friend. Andre and I were complete opposites in many ways. School subjects came easily to me, while his diary was filled with 3s and the occasional 4. Compared to my peers, I seemed like a frail child, whereas he played on the basketball team and could do more pull-ups than anyone else in the class. I was introverted, while he was always the life of the party. The one thing that united us was a shared passion. We both loved seeking adventures wherever we went. It all started back in childhood when we opened the door to the basement of our house and were the first visitors in 50 years, excluding rats and cockroaches. Years passed, we grew older, but our craving for adventures remained unchanged. When we spotted a barely noticeable trail in the forest that bordered the city to the north, we simply couldn't ignore it. The midday sun pierced through the leaves of the trees as we trudged along the path, often losing sight of it. Footprints were imprinted in the dried mud. It had rained here 3 days ago, and it seemed like the footprints were made then. 20 minutes later, the trail led us to a clearing. In the center of the small clearing stood an old country house. Well, stood is an exaggeration. The cottage leaned to one side, and every single window was shattered. The house, where once a forester or some local hermit lived, had turned into yet another reminder that time spared nothing in this world. The inside of the cottage looked no better. The wind quietly whistled through the empty window frames. The floor was littered with glass shards and spiders scurried in the corners. The walls were covered in piles of semi-rotted debris, covered with moth-eaten fabric. It smelled of rotten wood, and despite the drafts, it was quite stuffy. A chain of the same dirty footprints stretched across the floor. We weren't the first curious visitors here. The atmosphere inside created such a stark contrast with the sunlit clearing that it made me feel uneasy. We split up and explored the rooms. Walking on the crumbling plaster, I examined the sagging couch with springs sticking out, trying to imagine who and how many years ago had last sat on it. Old abandoned buildings are interesting because they provide unprecedented scope for imagination. "Wow, look at this," I heard my friend's astonished exclamation. "Mikhail, come see this." Andrei was squatting, examining something on the floor. "There's a door to the cellar here, and there are tracks leading there." He felt for the handle on the floor and pulled the door towards himself. It opened easily. Andrei peered inside. "I don't see anything. It's as dark as a." We didn't have flashlights with us, so for a while we hesitated. Well, young, adventurous, and all that. In the end, I was the first to go down. The stairs creaked so loudly that you could probably hear it all over the forest. "Well, what's there?" shouted Andrei from above. "I don't know," I replied, waiting for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. And then I heard a sound that made my hair stand on end. Someone was shuffling in the dark corner. You might think that some homeless person decided to catch some sleep in a dark and quiet place, but it wasn't the reason why my blood ran cold. Together with the sounds of quiet fussing, I heard the clinking of a metal chain. Somewhere on the edge of visibility, blurry outlines of a figure resembling a human appeared, and, damn, I should have run away immediately instead of staring at it. So it wasn't a person. Mikhail fidgeted with the lighter in his hands, nervously biting his lips. It was hard to believe in such things, but he apparently didn't intend to embellish the story. Anatomically, it was a person: 2 arms, 2 legs, a head. But when he stepped into the light area, it was hard for me to imagine that such people exist somewhere in the world. The creature was completely naked, covered in dirt from head to toe. It resembled. No, it was a skin-stretched skeleton. Long, tangled hair hung down. A massive chain was attached to its ankle, rattling with every step. Before darting upstairs, I involuntarily looked into its eyes. What did I see there? Fear. Animalistic fear mixed with aggression and something else. That gaze. It will haunt me in nightmares for the rest of my life. We bolted out of the house, with an inhuman scream echoing behind us, turning into a shriek. Ignoring the shopkeeper, Mikhail took out a cigarette and lit it. I noticed his hands trembling as he brought the lighter to his face. What happened next, I remember vaguely. Somehow we ended up at my place. On the way, I told Andre what I had seen. He worked in the police, and extreme situations were not new to him. He thought faster than me. The chain on the leg indicated that the poor soul was held captive. Whether for ransom or for fun, who knows, there were plenty of perverts back then. That's when I realized what I saw in that gaze besides fear. It was desperation and a faint glimmer of fading hope. Hope that someone would pull him out of this hell. The last time I saw something like that was in the eyes of dying wounded when I worked as a doctor in a war zone. Dreadful. By nightfall, Andre decided to leave the house to assemble a task force and visit the cottage again. Of course, I couldn't fall asleep. He promised to tell me everything as soon as the special operation was over. Finishing his cigarette, Mikhail automatically pulled out another one from the box and lit it again. I called him the next morning, but there was no answer. Not getting a response during the day, I raised hell at his precinct. Reluctant answers came, and if I hadn't been Andre's friend, known by everyone, they would have just sent me packing. By evening, when the workday was over and there was an opportunity to talk in an informal setting, Investigator Ilarion, after making me promise 1,000 times to keep quiet in front of his superiors, told me what he knew himself. Did I find out more? Yes. Did it make me feel even slightly calmer? Not at all. The first group maintained radio contact with the police station from the car. Obviously, you couldn't get into the woods with it, so the group walked to the house. A radio operator remained in the car, receiving signals from the walkie-talkies. As they approached the cottage, the communication deteriorated. The operatives reported that they were entering the cottage, but after that, it was impossible to make out anything amid the noise and interference. About 2 minutes later, the radio operator reported hearing gunfire. In the background, there were clicking sounds, as if he was loading his pistol. A couple of minutes later, he said he saw something in the distance among the trees. Even the interference during transmission couldn't conceal the excitement in his voice. When a barely audible rustling was heard in the distance, his voice broke into a shout. His speech became unintelligible, but amid the general verbal flow, words from a prayer could be heard. Whatever he saw there, it plunged him into panic, a man who had been trained for years to keep his cool in any situation. He didn't even try to start the car or get out of the cabin. He just kept repeating over and over that we had awakened the devil. Soon, a single shot rang out, and the communication was cut off. The second group arrived early in the morning. At the entrance to the woods, they found a police car, the same one that the first group had arrived in. The cabin was completely empty, no traces of bullets in the cabin. No blood, no radio operator. As if the night before, he hadn't heard a shot at the station, but a clap that sent him into another dimension. Inside the cabin, chaos reigned. Old furniture was scattered throughout the house. The floor was soaked in blood and littered with cartridges. The walls bore bullet marks. What did the group encounter in the cabin that turned 4 armed men into a bloody mess? No one knows to this day. But what really shocked the group was the situation in the basement. In the center of the dark room, they found 2 neatly stacked piles, one containing the body parts of the slain police officers, the other containing gnawed bones. The creature not only killed them all, but also feasted on them. The captive disappeared. In the basement, they found only the chain that held him and an old, stinking mattress on which he slept. In a pool of blood next to the mattress, the operatives found a human foot. The wounds on it were jagged, as if from bites, but somewhat peculiar, as if the prisoner had bitten off his own leg, trying to escape from his captivity. The bloody trail led to the stairs, but tracking it further was simply impossible. The case remains unsolved to this day. For a while, all the newspapers were screaming about it, but the case was quickly hushed up. Now, The folder with this case is surely buried so deep in the police archives that it can't be found even with great desire. We left the cafe. I thanked Mikhail for the interesting story, trying to inject some cheerfulness into my voice. Imagine an hour ago we were still talking about work, and I was sure that I would go home, thinking about how to write what he asked me about, faster and easier. Now my brain was unable to process any information not related to this strange story. "What still bothers me," said Mikhail as we were about to part ways, "are those dirty footprints that Andre and I saw. They led to the basement, but I didn't see any tracks going in the opposite direction. The creature on the chain couldn't have left them. It wasn't wearing shoes. So when I went down to the basement, there was someone else there. Perhaps the same person who later gave the warm welcome to the task force. Someone who took Andre away." Mikhail took a deep breath and exhaled with a sigh. "And he knows me by sight.